Down in Richmond, Virginia sits a massive facility churning out a higher volume of smokes than whole nations manage to go through. Those assembly lines spit out 600 million units every 24 hours. That basically equals a daily drag for every single soul living across North America. When December 31st rolls around, that adds up to a staggering 146 billion sticks, all crafted within the exact same complex. But the wildest detail is this. The folks at Philip Morris completely ignored the cautious rote. Spreading their operations across 10 separate plants would have easily shielded the corporation from natural catastrophes. It would have insulated them against labor walkouts and government red tape. Yet they chose to go all in, closing outside locations to consolidate the whole show in Richmond. A lone facility in a single town pushing every last bet toward the center of the table. To understand that gamble, you have to rewind to London's poorest neighborhoods, where a newcomer from Germany launched a tiny smoke stand that ultimately grew into a global powerhouse. It intertwines with the absolute brilliant marketing push in commercial history. You'll hear about courtroom battles that almost tanked the brand, plus a financial wager so reckless it shatters standard corporate wisdom. You can actually spot this compound right off Interstate 95, heavily trafficked down the eastern seaboard. Massive branding signs loom high above the architecture, flashing iconic names like Marlboro Benson and Hedges and Merritt. Your eyes couldn't possibly skip over it. Past those doors operates a manufacturing beast so streamlined that it generates almost 50% of the nationwide market supply. We are looking at far more than just dried leaves here. This reveals an extreme monopoly of control. It demonstrates the consequences of tying your entire livelihood to one item, one game plan, and one solitary spot. It is the saga of observing a dynasty climb to the top, rule the market, and then stare down its own demise as the machinery relentlessly hums along. Why exactly would anyone cram 146 billion products into a singular space? That is the mystery we are about to unravel. Chapter 1. From Whitechapel to Bond Street, London, 1835. Whitechapel hardly served as the typical breeding ground for massive dynasties. You were looking at the absolute grittiest district in town. Packed housing units, tight walkways, and the lingering stench of burning coal mixed with waste defined the area. It served as the drop zone where penniless arrivals usually washed up just trying to scrape by. Right in the middle of that misery, Philip Morris took his first breath. He was the kid of a German dad who made the trip across the water hunting for a better shot at life. His folks lacked both cash and high society ties. Their one ace in the hole was the leaf. Back in 1847, while the kid was merely 12 years of age, his parents launched a modest storefront down on Bond Street. That avenue sat universes away from Whitechapel. This served as the playground for wealthy Londoners dropping serious cash, providing fertile ground to establish a real enterprise. They struck gold with their scheduling. Paper-wrapped smokes were newly trending across Britain, stepping out from the shadow of traditional stogies and pipe bowls. The family eagerly embraced the shift and completely capitalized on it. They spent plenty of seasons pushing goods manufactured by outside vendors, though the young man was already dreaming up grander schemes. Reaching 1854, he grew tired of simply flipping inventory. He began crafting his personal line of hand-spun smokes designed specifically for the wealthy patrons browsing his counters. A crucial turning point had arrived. This marked his initial evolution from a basic merchant into a full-fledged producer. Sales numbers climbed at a very reliable pace. Our guy spent his days carving out a solid name, locking in dependable supply chains, and truly mastering the manufacturing grind. Jumping ahead to 1870, he leveled up by setting up shop at 108 New Bond Street, dropping an anchor directly inside the fanciest retail hub. This was a massive flex rather than just another store launch. He had completely shed his old identity as that poor foreign youth from the slums. The man now stood as a highly respected proprietor, boasting prime real estate and an expanding enterprise. His master plan was flawlessly unfolding. However, tragedy derailed the narrative soon after. 3 years later, in 1873, he passed away. He was merely 37 years of age. A brutal bug, the kind doctors could knock out with simple meds nowadays, finished him off in less than a week. After dedicating every waking moment to growing his brand and fighting tooth and nail out of poverty, he perished right at the finish line of his success. The founder missed out entirely on the phenomenal heights his brand would reach, dying way before the Marlboro Man or the worldwide dominance ever materialized. Drawing his final breaths inside that fancy cigar parlor, he likely assumed his modest legacy was headed straight to the grave right alongside him. Logically, the curtain should have dropped right there. A vast majority of startups back in the 1870s usually folded whenever the boss kicked the bucket. Luckily, his widow Margaret completely refused to watch her husband's hard work turn to dust. She grabbed the reins, immediately pulling her brother-in-law Leopold into the daily management. This went entirely against the grain. Females simply weren't allowed to head up corporations during the Victorian era. That being said, she tossed societal norms out the window and focused strictly on keeping the lights on, managing to stabilize the rocking boat with Leopold's help. The duo kept the doors unlocked, nurtured their existing client base, and made sure those manufacturing lines never stopped rolling. Steering perfectly through the absolute mess of a dead visionary, they emerged entirely unscathed. Over the following decades, they thrived rather than just treading water. The team broadened their footprint, brought on plenty of fresh labor, and seriously ramped up their overall output volume. Right around the dawn of the 20th century, the Philip Morris firm had established itself as a serious contender within the British tobacco trade. What is truly wild about this entire story is that the founder himself, the very individual printed across all those cartons today, missed out on the massive success entirely. Although he laid the initial groundwork, he passed away long before the real empire started taking shape. His wife and sibling were the ones who actually constructed the business. It is the hidden background tale that rarely gets mentioned. A child of immigrants passing away prematurely, a fierce wife who absolutely would not surrender, and an enterprise that miraculously beat incredible obstacles. This serves as proof that massive dynasties are never constructed entirely by a single individual. Instead, they take shape thanks to those who step up following the creator's death and choose to drive the vision onward. Chapter 2: The Origins of Marlboro. By 1902, the brand had expanded way beyond its London roots, with the operation Margaret and Leopold nurtured doing incredibly well. However, the genuine gold mine lay over in the States, where a booming economy, rapidly growing metropolises, massive fortunes, and a soaring demand for smokes created the perfect storm. Consequently, they took the leap, set up a new headquarters right in New York City, and began catering directly to consumers in the United States. Over the following 20 years, leadership took a cautious approach, pushing high-end smokes exclusively to wealthy elite crowds. It was pretty standard stuff until 1924, when an executive internally pitched a concept that initially looked like pure genius. They decided to craft a smoke exclusively targeted at ladies, naming the product Marlboro, and pushing a tagline claiming it was mild, as made delicate, smooth, and fiercely girly. That entire marketing push aimed to normalize female smoking habits, trying to frame the act as something sophisticated and completely socially appropriate. Sporting delicate white wrappers, every single detail projected sheer class and elegance, which frankly felt like a very logical strategy. Ladies were gaining unprecedented autonomy and stepping boldly into the public eye, since the 1920s heavily revolved around shattering outdated societal norms. Tobacco executives recognized a fresh demographic and eagerly chased the profits. Yet this new release just could not gain the traction executives anticipated, generating merely average revenue. The numbers were pretty uninspiring, leading to a supposedly brilliant pivot during the 1930s to solve a major annoyance female consumers faced. Leaving makeup residue on the paper was widely viewed as tacky and awkward, prompting the brand to engineer a unique workaround. Enter the beauty tip, a custom red-colored mouthpiece, specifically designed to camouflage bright cosmetic smudges in a highly functional way. Females could now enjoy a puff without stressing over messy stains, an inventive tweak that absolutely should have scored massive profits for the company. Unfortunately, it totally flopped, leaving the label to barely scrape by for decades until World War II completely flipped the industry upside down. Once the conflict ended, tobacco consumption skyrocketed across the nation because returning veterans brought back intense nicotine addictions. Since packs were literally handed out in military supply kits abroad, cigarette manufacturers were suddenly rolling in cash and experiencing explosive growth. Every single competitor prospered, while this particular name flatlined. By the late 1940s, it was on life support, holding barely a 1% sliver of the sector. Amidst a wildly profitable boom period for the trade, this specific line remained completely off the radar. Targeting ladies proved disastrous. The colored mouthpiece felt incredibly cheesy, and the overall trademark lacked any clear direction, energy, or purpose. A typical corporation would have simply pulled the plug, accepted the financial hit, and shifted all resources toward items that were actually moving off shelves. Yet the executives noticed massive untapped potential in that specific title. The word itself carried a tough, gritty resonance, perfectly aligning with a massive consumer void that rival corporations were completely ignoring. They wanted to push filtered smokes to guys, which was tricky, since mouthpieces were viewed as girly, while tough dudes strictly puffed on raw, harsh stuff like Camel's Lucky Strikes and rugged, straightforward blends. However, a massive shift was happening as medical studies began actively connecting heavy tobacco use with deadly respiratory diseases. Consumers grew increasingly terrified, prompting many to kick the habit entirely while others desperately hunted for a less harmful alternative. Products featuring mouthpieces appeared to be the perfect fix, yet dudes absolutely refused to be seen holding a ladies' item, creating a massive wide-open niche. Anyone who could successfully market a protective tip while keeping the vibe intensely gritty and macho was guaranteed to strike absolute gold. Fast forward to 1954, and the firm executed a legendary pivot, opting to tear down the brand entirely and rebuild it from scratch. They scrapped the whole playbook, tossing out that delicate slogan, killing the red-tipped gimmick, and thoroughly wiping away any trace of ladylike energy. The new game plan aimed to rebrand this exact product as the absolute toughest smoke across the United States, representing an insanely risky wager. Flipping a heavily rejected female-centric item into a macho staple is basically unheard of, since the lingering stigma was intense, though leadership simply brushed those concerns aside. They enlisted the absolute top-tier advertising firm in the nation and gave them one simple directive: inject pure testosterone into the product. The ensuing campaign permanently transformed the marketing world, even though back in 1954, the label was just a running joke, a fancy female accessory gathering dust on the shelves. The corporation was preparing to take that exact laughingstock and catapult it into the highest-grossing tobacco empire across the entire globe. The million-dollar puzzle was, how exactly do you persuade rugged American guys to light up something their own spouses had already rejected? And the brilliant solution ultimately arrived via a Chicago-based visionary who possessed a deep, intuitive grasp of modern consumer psychology. You are never just pushing dried leaves. You are peddling a lifestyle, and the specific persona they were preparing to launch would evolve into the greatest commercial icon ever seen. Chapter 3. The Marlboro Man changes the game. The executives at Philip Morris were desperate for a lifeline, which they ultimately discovered out in Chicago. That lifeline came in the form of Leo Burnett, a guy who had already cemented his status as a legendary genius in the national advertising scene. Burnett earned that stellar reputation by grasping a fundamental truth that went completely over the heads of his competitors. Consumers aren't actually purchasing physical goods. They are paying for an idealized version of themselves. Any ordinary agency would have kicked Philip Morris to the curb when they pitched the idea of taking Marlboro, a totally washed-up ladies' brand, and pitching it to a male demographic. Burnett, however, looked at the situation through a totally different lens, completely ignoring the brand's history of failure. Instead, he viewed it as an empty slate. By 1954, Burnett and his crew dove headfirst into giving Marlboro a massive makeover. Pushing the filter feature was a walk in the park, since the engineering held up and the medical benefits were an easy sell. The real hurdle was wiping away years of delicate, ladylike branding and injecting so much testosterone into the product that guys would completely erase its feminine roots from their memories. The answer Burnett came up with was brilliantly straightforward: invent a brand new persona. He needed an ultimate symbol of manliness strong enough to wipe the slate clean. The question was, who fits that bill? What specific figure perfectly embodies pure toughness, total self-reliance, and gritty resilience? When the initial Marlboro Man push hit the public, it actually featured a diverse lineup of guys. You had a rugged fireman posing casually by his rig with his sleeves pushed back. There was also a stoic naval officer looking out at the horizon, a builder rocking a hard hat and flashing some ink, and a sun-beaten cattle rancher posted up out in the wide-open prairie. Every single figure offered a unique take on classic American machismo, highlighting blue-collar champions who got their hands dirty to make a living. The real secret sauce, though, was a very deliberate visual cue. Every last one of those guys sported hand ink, and that specific choice was crucial. Back in the 1950s, body art was far from acceptable in polite society. It was strictly reserved for veterans, motorcycle gangs, and rough-and-tumble workers who operated far away from boring office jobs. Flashing that ink sent a clear message. This smoke isn't for soft guys hanging out at the golf course. It is strictly for gritty, everyday dudes. That marketing strategy caused an absolute shockwave. In a mere 12 months, revenue absolutely skyrocketed, jumping from $154 million all the way up to an unbelievable $5 billion. To put that in perspective, that is a 3,241% jump. The retail industry had quite literally never witnessed growth on that scale before. The brand transformed from a total joke into an absolute juggernaut in the blink of an eye, leaving literally every guy in the nation itching to buy the pack featuring the rancher. Burnett, however, was not about to rest on his laurels, especially after spotting a fascinating trend in the initial data. While consumers connected with all the tough guys, the ranch hand struck a completely different, much deeper chord. Something magical existed in that specific portrait: the vast wilderness, the fierce independence, and the callback to the Wild West struck a nerve that naval officers and firemen just could not reach. The rancher represented way more than just macho energy. He embodied pure, unadulterated liberty. So in 1963, Burnett pulled the trigger. The agency doubled down entirely on the Western figure. They rolled out the famous Marlboro country promotions, which reached legendary status almost the second they hit the public. The diverse cast was scrapped entirely, and the mixed bag approach was thrown right out the window. From that moment on, the brand was tied to a single powerful visual: a solitary frontiersman roughing it in the wild, answering to absolutely nobody. They paired it with an effortlessly catchy slogan: "Come to where the flavor is." Come to Marlboro Country. The visuals were absolutely breathtaking, packed with sweeping desert vistas, tough guys riding stallions, and cozy fires blazing beneath a canopy of stars. The ultimate goal was no longer about merely pushing a tobacco product. They were pitching a romanticized fantasy of classic manhood that hooked every guy in the country, appealing heavily to corporate desk jockeys who had never even set foot near a stable. Then the team struck absolute gold when they discovered Darryl Winfield. The guy was completely untouched by Hollywood and had zero modeling experience. He was a legitimate dirt-under-his-fingernails cattle rancher straight out of Oklahoma. His rugged features, natural swagger, and raw, undeniable realness were impossible to replicate in a studio. Once the executives signed him in 1968, he owned the brand's identity for more than 20 years. He barely uttered a single word in the commercials, mainly because he never really had to. His mere presence, whether he was standing tall, saddling up, or doing manual labor, spoke volumes, doing all the heavy lifting for the campaign. His deeply lined face showed the permanent marks of brutal sun exposure and biting winds. You could just tell he had survived a grueling existence and emerged as a total badass because of it. That exact gritty vibe was the actual product on the shelf. Forget the nicotine. They were peddling pure grit, ultimate freedom, in the romanticized folklore of the Wild West. Fast forward to the 1970s, and the brand hadn't merely dominated the filter market. It claimed the throne as the absolute most popular smoke in the country, bar none. Burnett managed to scoop up a massive failure and engineer it into a defining piece of pop culture. That rugged cowboy evolved into a global icon, standing shoulder to shoulder with giants like Coca-Cola and Mickey Mouse. The experts over at Advertising Age eventually crowned the initiative as the single most brilliant marketing push of the 20th century. Calling it that was completely accurate too. The bold move accomplished far more than just tossing a life preserver to a sinking business. It literally ripped up the traditional playbook for consumer outreach. The strategy clearly demonstrated that even if an item had the worst possible optics and targeted the completely wrong demographic, you could still flip the script entirely and brainwash the public into loving it. The only real requirements were crafting a killer narrative and having the absolute sheer nerve to blast it from the rooftops. The company blossomed into a billion-dollar juggernaut entirely because Burnett grasped a core psychological concept way better than his peers. Pitch the fantasy, never the merchandise. The specific fantasy he pushed, that lawless frontier, the solitary rider, hit a nerve that changed everything. That sense of absolute independence struck such a deep chord that guys weren't just craving a smoke, they were craving an entirely new identity. Chapter 4: Constructing the Dynasty. Fast forward to 1972, and Philip Morris pulled off a feat nobody thought possible 20 years prior. They finally dethroned R.J. Reynolds to claim the title of America's premier cigarette maker. Packs of Marlboro were flying off the shelves way quicker than the plants could roll them. Consumer appetite had absolutely skyrocketed. It was the ultimate good problem to have. Their production lines simply could not keep pace with the massive order volumes. To fix this, leadership made a bold call that would ultimately shape the corporation's destiny for the following half-century. Their game plan was to construct the most colossal cigarette production plant on the planet, and the chosen location for this titan was Richmond, Virginia. Selecting Richmond was a no-brainer for several key factors. It sat right in the middle of leaf-growing territory, a region that had been cultivating crops since the 1600s. All the necessary logistics were already established. They had train tracks, interstates, and a local labor pool deeply familiar with the trade. Furthermore, its prime spot midway down the eastern seaboard meant major metropolitan areas were right next door, keeping freight logistics incredibly smooth. The grand opening of the Richmond Manufacturing Center on Commerce Road took place in 1973. Yet calling it a mere production plant would be an understatement. It was an absolute declaration of industry supremacy. The complex stretched over 150 acres, roughly translating to a footprint larger than 100 football fields. Half a dozen gigantic structures were linked by a complex web of automated tracks and moving belts encompassing 1,600,000 square feet of pure manufacturing floor. Stepping through the doors revealed endless corridors of mechanical equipment that seemed to vanish into the horizon. Every single unit cranked out smokes at mind-boggling speeds. Right out of the gate, they could churn out 200 million sticks every single 24 hours. Let that sink in. That output is roughly equivalent to handing 25 smokes to every single resident of the Big Apple day in and day out. Shockingly, that was only the baseline. The architects mapped out the ground specifically to accommodate future growth, ensuring they could effortlessly crank up volume as sales climbed. Their scheduling was incredibly lucky. Coinciding with the plant's debut, Marlboro captured the crown as the #1 selling smoke on the entire globe. We aren't just talking domestic dominance. This was a worldwide victory. The rugged frontiersman marketing push had officially crossed borders. Billboards featuring the brand popped up across Europe, throughout Asia, down in South America, literally in every corner of the map. That iconic crimson and white box featuring the classic chevron turned into one of the most famous global trademarks imaginable, and the Virginia complex served as the beating heart of it all. Raw agricultural goods arrived at the loading docks, huge truckloads sourced from growers throughout Virginia and North Carolina, and finished cartons rolled right out the back. Freight haulers, packed tight with product, hit the highways destined for all 50 states. To keep up, the place stayed open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Employees worked around the clock in 3 distinct rotations to guarantee zero downtime. Come 1976, the brand hadn't merely maintained its global supremacy, it finally clinched the title of America's favorite smoke, leaving every rival brand choking on its dust. In under a few decades, the corporation transformed from an underdog into the unrivaled king of the industry. Every single risk they took yielded massive dividends. The brand overhaul, the rugged Western mascot, and dropping a fortune on that mammoth East Coast facility. The entire strategy hit the bullseye. They had reached the absolute summit of their success. Anyone observing those loaded big rigs pulling out of the shipping yards in the mid-1970s was basically looking at the golden era of the country's leaf empires. Operations inside were incredibly streamlined and precise. Inspectors were fanatical about standards, demanding that every single smoke match strict criteria. Identical sizing, matching masks, and the exact same mix of cured leaves. The executives had finally cracked the code on delivering uniformity at unbelievable volumes. Delivering that kind of reliable experience was a huge driver of consumer loyalty. Whether you grabbed a soft pack in New York, Los Angeles, or Miami, the flavor profile was completely uniform. Furthermore, the massive plant supercharged the local economy. It provided thousands of solid careers, excellent union salaries, healthcare perks, and long-term security. Whole communities practically survived on those corporate direct deposits. The corporation's roots tangled deeply with the area's culture. The municipality transformed far beyond just a spot with a manufacturing hub. It earned the moniker of America's smoke capital, and this specific corporation sat right on the throne. However, folks completely ignored a looming threat back in 1973 during the grand opening ceremonies. Medical research outlining severe risk was quietly accumulating. Official government health warnings were becoming significantly sharper and more direct. Sick consumers had already begun initiating legal action, though mostly under the radar at first. The opposition groups were tiny and easily dismissed, yet their numbers were steadily increasing. At the time, though, nobody really cared. Back in 1973, lighting up was culturally celebrated, and that rugged Western icon was as popular as ever. The Virginia plant essentially acted like a license to print cash. The board of directors didn't sweat what lay ahead because they were completely occupied tallying up their current windfalls. And those windfalls were absolutely massive. The sprawling complex stood as a physical testament to every single corporate victory. Drive operational perfection and total market control. It served as a massive tribute to what happens when brilliant advertising meets enormous manufacturing capabilities. The executives managed to grab an underperforming item, completely overhaul its image market, the absolute hell out of it, and construct an industrial titan capable of feeding a nationwide addiction. It was the exact point in history where their grand vision perfectly crystallized. That humble little storefront opened by a newcomer in Whitechapel had morphed into a worldwide powerhouse. A failing product originally pitched to ladies had transformed into the ultimate symbol of rugged manhood. Meanwhile, their sprawling production facility down in Richmond operated with absolute precision, an unyielding machine that stood as the literal monument to their triumph. The operation ran flawlessly. The executives had every single detail on lock. Yet no dynasty rules indefinitely. The undercurrents of opposition destined to shake up the corporation were quietly gathering strength. The leadership simply remained completely clueless about the incoming storm. Chapter 5. Back when this corporation dominated the globe, the late 1970s and the 1980s were essentially their private playground. Their flagship brand wasn't merely succeeding, it was leaving every other rival completely in the dust. As early as 1972, that specific pack had already secured the crown as the most popular smoke on the planet, yet they were only getting warmed up. Fast forward to 1983, and the enterprise officially hit the absolute peak, reigning supreme as the undisputed king of the global tobacco trade. Second place wasn't even in the rearview mirror. They had completely crushed British American tobacco, thoroughly dominated Japan tobacco, and wiped out the rest of the field. That sprawling kingdom, born in a tiny British storefront, now held a monopoly over international smoking habits, the exact same way Standard Oil once held a chokehold on domestic petroleum. However, merely moving packs of smokes wasn't enough for the top brass. They craved total omnipresence, aiming to link their trademark with every single passion folks enjoyed. Consequently, the firm launched a massive financial backing campaign, transforming themselves into arguably the most recognizable corporate entity on the globe. Formula One motor racing practically blended into their core identity. You couldn't miss that iconic crimson and white geometric design wrapping around Ferraris as they tore through legendary circuits like Monaco, Silverstone, and Monza. Countless viewers glued to their television screens Saturday and Sunday afternoons had that branding burned into their retinas. This transcended basic marketing. It was full-blown societal infiltration. The corporation funneled cash into racket sports, backed professional soccer squads, bankrolled winter athletics, and even paid for gallery showcases and live music festivals. Whenever an event carried massive hype and high status, the brand absolutely had to slap its logo front and center. Their brilliance lay in subtlety. While international governments slowly began rolling out television broadcast restrictions on their products, the executives cleverly sniffed out backdoor workarounds. Blocked from running a commercial break while the gridiron matchup airs. No problem at all. Just buy the naming rights to the arena. Bankroll the entire franchise. Slap that familiar emblem right on the players' uniforms. The fans are forced to look at it regardless. Suddenly, the product is emotionally tied to a sport those crowds deeply adore. At the exact same time, profits were flooding the corporate accounts so rapidly that leadership began hunting for investments entirely outside the smoking industry. Back in 1970, the firm scooped up the Miller Brewing Company, essentially pairing cold lagers with a quick smoke, a flawless combination of casual indulgences. That brewery was barely keeping its head above water during the buyout, yet the new owners simply copy-pasted the exact same promotional wizardry that had skyrocketed their flagship cigarette. Just a handful of years later, their low-calorie brew exploded into one of the most purchased alcoholic beverages nationwide, and that success only made the boardroom hungrier. Moving into 1985, the corporation swallowed up General Foods for a staggering $5.6 billion. This was hardly a minor play. That massive conglomerate controlled household staples, including Maxwell House coffee, Jell-O Oscar Mayer, and Kool-Aid. Virtually overnight, the enterprise evolved way past its identity as a simple cigarette supplier. They had infiltrated your kitchen cabinets, stocked your fridge, and snuck right into your children's midday meals. 3 years down the line, in 1988, they executed an even more colossal takeover, snatching up Kraft. Dropping an unbelievable $12.9 billion, it stood as the most expensive corporate buyout ever recorded outside the petroleum sector during that era. Overnight, they controlled the dairy aisle with Kraft Singles, Philadelphia Cream Cheese Miracle Whip, and Velveeta. Stroll through any supermarket in the country, and chances are you were staring directly at a product funneling cash back to their headquarters. This entire playbook was incredibly clever on two distinct fronts. The initial benefit was pure portfolio expansion. Should the smoking market ever take a serious hit, the executives could rely on alternative rivers of cash. The subsequent benefit brought a thick layer of corporate legitimacy. Cigarette manufacturers were slowly beginning to face serious public backlash. However, grocery conglomerates flew totally under the radar. Absolutely no one is going to riot over a box of macaroni and cheese. By absorbing these beloved pantry staples, the enterprise completely smoothed out its rough edges, shedding the stigma of a vice peddler to rebrand itself as a harmless, wide-ranging household products giant. Down south in Virginia, that sprawling Richmond facility operated as the absolute core, pumping life into this massive empire. That local municipality totally leaned into its reputation as America's tobacco town. The corporation wasn't merely offering local jobs. They were the undisputed economic lifeline of the region. Teenagers crossing the graduation stage walked away absolutely certain they could secure a reliable paycheck working the manufacturing lines. Entire households purchased real estate, put their kids through university, and built cushy nest eggs entirely backed by those factory salaries. The brass even paid for youth baseball leagues, cut massive checks to local medical centers, and heavily subsidized neighborhood initiatives. The firm didn't just operate within the city limits. They practically possessed the entire town, carrying all the wonderful and terrifying implications that come with that kind of power. Take a cruise along Commerce Road, and you couldn't miss those 6 gigantic structures churning out product around the clock. Massive semi-trailers queued up endlessly to transport fresh cartons, while enormous crowds of employees flooded the gates during every single shift rotation. That compound effectively functioned as an independent metropolis, entirely self-sufficient, fiercely productive, and virtually minting its own cash. And the sheer volume of that wealth was mind-blowing. The financial returns the corporation pulled down throughout the 1980s were flat-out stratospheric. Producing a single smoke required literally cents, yet consumers happily handed over whole dollars for a pack. The profit ratio was practically unethical. That flagship red and white brand by itself was raking in billions of dollars in sales every single year. When you factored in the brewery, the grocery giant, and the mountain of other corporate buyouts under their belt, the enterprise cemented itself as one of the most lucrative businesses in the entire country. Shareholder value absolutely skyrocketed without a single slump in sight. Financial analysts absolutely worshiped the stock. Yet there was a massive twist that everyone actively chose to ignore. Deep in the middle of the 1980s, this truly felt like an untouchable era of prosperity. Yet time wasn't exactly on their side anymore. Cigarette consumption across the United States had hit its highest point and was steadily dropping off. Medical alarms were growing deafening. Legal battles were flooding the justice system, while public advocates aggressively demanded marketing restrictions, steeper levies, and completely clear air zones. Official medical advisories from the top doctor in the country left zero room for doubt cigarettes were lethal, and the entire public was fully aware of that fact. The big bosses at Philip Morris were well aware of this reality, yet the astronomical profits made it incredibly easy for them to look the other way. Armed with elite legal teams, virtually unlimited funds, and Washington's fiercest political influencers, they felt confident they could crush any litigation stall, new rules, and defend their territory. Plus, their global footprint was only getting larger as they pushed heavily into Asian, African, and Eastern European markets. They figured that even if the domestic market totally rejected tobacco, countless potential customers existed overseas, keeping the production lines humming perfectly in Richmond. That iconic cowboy continued to grace highway signs and glossy pages, while Formula One vehicles kept speeding around tracks sporting that unmistakable crimson logo. Kraft continued moving massive amounts of cheese, and the parent corporation just kept raking in enormous profits, thoroughly believing their reign would literally never end. We are talking about the ultimate high point, the absolute pinnacle of Big Tobacco's dominance. It marked an era where a single corporation successfully conquered its own sector, branched out into totally different markets and wove itself so thoroughly into the financial and cultural fabric that it appeared virtually invincible. However, massive dynasties always believe they are entirely bulletproof right up until the exact moment their entire foundation crumbles. As for Philip Morris, that inevitable collapse approached far quicker than anybody could have anticipated. Chapter 6. Courtroom Doomsday. The 1990s completely blindsided the corporation. Over several decades, they had successfully swatted away individual claims, completely exhausting their challengers through infinite court delays and sheer attorney muscle. Up until then, they had never dropped a high-stakes trial or been forced to hand over any serious settlement cash. The game plan was incredibly straightforward: reject every accusation battle endlessly and refuse all compromises, a tactic that functioned flawlessly until the walls finally closed in. Heading into the mid-1990s, the courtroom battlefield transformed completely. State administrations were drowning in medical bills tied to tobacco usage, covering endless lung therapies, cardiac care, and emphysema treatments. Public health funds were hemorrhaging cash, leading local governments to draw a line in the sand and refuse to keep footing the bill for the destruction big tobacco left behind. Politicians demanded to be paid back. Finally, in 1998, the ultimate blow was delivered. Enter the Master Settlement Agreement. The executives at Philip Morris, alongside rival industry giants, officially consented to hand over $26 billion across 25 years to 46 different states. $206 billion in total. It went down as the single biggest financial compromise ever recorded in the American legal system. Those massive funds were entirely earmarked to reimburse medical expenditures and bankroll campaigns designed to get people to quit lighting up. Yet there was a massive catch: nobody actually confessed to any wrongdoing. From a strict legal standpoint, the corporations completely avoided taking any blame. They simply signed over a jaw-dropping fortune just to sweep the massive headache under the rug, only to discover their nightmare was just beginning. Merely 12 months later, in 1999, the Federal Justice Department slapped Philip Morris with a massive lawsuit using the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, better known as RICO. Just pause and truly absorb that fact. This specific legislation was explicitly created to dismantle dangerous mob families and heavily armed criminal networks. Yet here were federal prosecutors aiming it directly at one of the biggest corporate powerhouses in the entire nation. The core allegations were absolutely devastating. Authorities charged that this company and its peers had orchestrated a massive decades-long cover-up to intentionally mislead everyday people regarding the deadly consequences and highly gripping nature of their products. The executives were fully aware that their items triggered deadly tumors way back in the 1950s, yet they purposefully buried the evidence. They clearly understood the chemical hooks involved and actively tweaked ingredient ratios just to guarantee long-term dependency, aggressively targeting teenagers, all while publicly swearing they left youth alone. Furthermore, they had bankrolled entirely fake scientific studies to create public confusion around actual medical facts. Interestingly enough, federal prosecutors were not looking for a financial payout here. Their goal was to have a judge formally brand these executives as mob-style fraudsters who had constructed a massive dynasty entirely out of deception. Litigation stretched out interminably. The corporate defense team deployed every conceivable weapon in their arsenal, utilizing endless filings, high-priced specialists, and every stall tactic imaginable. However, the final verdict arrived in 2006 with Judge Gladys Kessler officially finding the corporation guilty of violating the RICO statutes. The bench officially determined that leadership had executed a wildly intricate and deeply synchronized scam spanning several generations. Executives had fabricated the truth regarding bodily harm, falsified data on dependency, covered up their youth advertising pushes, and basically spun falsehoods about every single detail. It was an incredibly crushing legal blow. The final paperwork did not merely accuse them of bending regulations. It explicitly stated they were operating an underworld syndicate wearing a corporate mask. That rugged Western mascot was not actually a symbol of freedom at all, but rather the flashy public face of an enormous criminal plot. Meanwhile, the monetary punishments continued stacking incredibly high. Down in Illinois, the corporation was slapped with a localized verdict so massive it essentially threatened to wipe out their entire operation. Local authorities demanded a $12 billion security deposit just to allow the appeals process to move forward. That meant securing $12 billion in liquid assets simply for the right to remain in the courtroom. The tobacco giant simply did not possess that level of immediately accessible cash on hand, prompting them to execute an absolutely jaw-dropping maneuver. Executives boldly threatened to completely halt all of their scheduled payments tied to the nationwide mega settlement. Leadership effectively drew a hard line warning that if they were forced to put up the deposit, they would immediately walk away from the $206 billion owed to the rest of the country, creating a literal financial standoff. The state eventually backed down and lowered the required deposit, but the underlying threat echoed loudly. This corporate behemoth was fully prepared to detonate the entire national economy before they would ever surrender peacefully. Yet the true nightmare hadn't even arrived yet. Fast forward to 2017. Due to court mandates from their racketeering trial, the corporation faced forced marketing campaigns designed exclusively to confess their long history of deception to the world. These weren't tiny disclaimers hidden away online either. These apologies aired across primetime TV and major newspaper pages for countless Americans to see, creating an absolute public relations nightmare. The tobacco giant was legally forced to clearly broadcast how they purposefully engineered their smokes to keep buyers hooked, how they chemically tweaked the addictive ingredients, and how they intentionally targeted underage kids while swearing they never did. They even had to admit their goods caused more fatalities than homicides, severe immune diseases taking one's own life, illicit narcotics, auto accidents, and booze put together. Picture a brand that devoted 100 years to crafting a vibe of untamed liberty and cowboy toughness. Then suddenly they are shoved onto major broadcasting networks just to utter, "We completely deceived you. We played games with your health. The things we sell are fatal. Furthermore, we were aware of the dangers from day one." Witnessing a massive business get degraded this thoroughly was practically unheard of. Their iconic cowboy was no longer galloping off toward a picturesque horizon. Instead, he was essentially groveling before the judicial system, begging for forgiveness. That Virginia town definitely absorbed the blow. Production lines stayed active, yet the local sense of glory completely vanished. Employees walked into work fully aware that their daily labor supported items officially classified by the courts as tools of an illegal syndicate. The municipality's reputation as the nation's cigarette capital transformed from a point of civic bragging into a dark mark. Meanwhile, the enterprise that once seemed invincible, previously dominating the global nicotine market without equal, now carried the label of a legally condemned fraudster, mandated to openly confess that their entire kingdom rested upon a foundation of lies. Those glory days officially crashed and burned. Legal battles kept pouring in continuously. Government restrictions tightened relentlessly. Everyday citizens permanently viewed the habit with disgust. Consequently, the number of daily puffers plummeted year after year. Furthermore, the corporation found itself signing astronomical payouts to local governments nationwide annually. This served as a never-ending signal of their absolute defeat. However, there is a totally bizarre twist. Despite enduring endless court fights, severe racketeering judgments, and extreme brand embarrassment, that Virginia hub never actually stopped rolling tobacco. The manufacturing floors refused to go dark. Production pace didn't even dip slightly, largely because while the nation rallied against the habit, countless citizens remained helplessly hooked on the nicotine. Consequently, the corporate giant, adopting the fresh name Altria just to wash off the dirt of their controversies, still possessed inventory to push. Their kingdom might have been collapsing, but those machines hummed along flawlessly. This exact moment sparks the most fascinating chapter, mainly because the executive board's subsequent move was either absolute genius or pure madness relative to your perspective. Chapter 7. The Final Defense. Right around the mid-2000s, company leaders clearly recognized their domestic nicotine trade was on life support. Cigarette consumption statistics took a massive nosedive. Annually, the number of active puffers shrank significantly. Courtrooms remained perpetually packed with litigation. Oversight boards continuously clamped down on marketing rules. Everyone saw the writing on the wall. Stateside sales had clearly maxed out and were destined for an eternal downward spiral. Therefore, jumping to 2008, executives pulled off an extreme maneuver. They sliced the massive conglomerate right down the middle. A brand new global wing took control of all operations beyond the nation's borders. That sector held on to actual expansion potential, considering massive populations and emerging economies were only beginning to pick up the habit. Meanwhile, the original American branch retained control over all homegrown sales. This meant managing a collapsing, legally suffocated litigation-plagued domestic landscape. Leaders envisioned a pristine separation shielding their lucrative foreign momentum from the hopelessly toxic stateside disaster. Yet this partition birthed a fresh dilemma. The stateside division still commanded a massive army of devoted buyers, folks unwilling or unable to kick the habit. Against all odds, their flagship red and white pack remained the undisputed king of domestic tobacco sales, leading competitors by a massive margin. Walking away from this homegrown consumer base simply wasn't an option. Far too much cash was left sitting on the table. The real puzzle became, how exactly do you manage a collapsing enterprise that somehow remains insanely lucrative? What strategies extract every last penny from a terminal commercial sector? The corporate solution proved stunningly extreme: total centralization. Entering 2010, the company dropped a bombshell by revealing plans to permanently shutter their massive North Carolina plant and shift all stateside manufacturing directly into Virginia. Literally everything from every single red pack to each slender feminine cigarette, right down to the luxury brands purchased domestically, would start flowing out of one solitary address. This move completely contradicted every standard rule in the corporate risk management playbook. Common sense says you never wager your entire inventory on one spot. Establishing a solitary, highly vulnerable choke point is traditionally a terrible idea. Imagine dealing with a devastating blaze, massive union walkouts, or severe weather events. Picture a massive twister tearing across the Virginia landscape and leveling the entire facility. The country's complete stock of those beloved smokes would evaporate in an instant. However, analysts ran the numbers repeatedly, and those spreadsheets clearly indicated that clumping everything together was incredibly logical. Keeping several manufacturing hubs online burns through massive cash for upkeep, employee salaries, and general operating expenses. With consumer desire fading, maintaining excess production lines became totally unnecessary. Funneling every resource into a singular, highly optimized powerhouse proved significantly smarter than keeping a bunch of half-empty buildings operational. It was mass production efficiency pushed to the absolute limit. Consequently, that Virginia hub transformed into a fortified stronghold where the nicotine titans would stage their ultimate battle for domestic relevance. Executives dumped more than $200 million directly into revamping the gear, setting up cutting-edge robotics, and squeezing maximum value from every square foot of the floor plan. As a result, the location's output potential absolutely exploded, hitting a mind-blowing daily yield of 600 million smokes. We are talking about 25 million smokes pouring out every 60 minutes. The sheer volume is practically impossible to wrap your mind around. Looking back at just 2010, that Virginia facility cranked out 146 billion smokes. Yes, you heard that right, billion with a capital B. For a little context, imagine lighting up a fresh smoke every 60 seconds around the clock without ever sleeping. And you would still need more than 277,000 years to burn through what that plant manufactured during a single calendar year. What is even wilder is that every last one of those smokes originated from just a half dozen structures along Commerce Road. Take a drive down Interstate 95, that major highway stretching along the eastern seaboard, and the complex is right there in plain sight. Massive brand signs loom high above the rooftops, advertising names like Marlboro Benson and Hedges and Merritt to anybody cruising past the city limits. You really cannot overlook this towering shrine to a business that the nation had largely rejected. Yet behind those walls, the whole setup functioned like an absolute dream of modern engineering. Computerized robotics took care of practically the entire process. Raw leaf would arrive, undergo processing, get chopped up, and be mixed to strict recipes. Mechanical rollers then assembled the final product faster than any person could ever hope to. We are talking about 20,000 smokes flying out of a single device every 60 seconds. High-tech scanners inspected each individual item, tossing out whatever fell short of perfection. From there, automated wrappers boxed them, stuffed them into larger cases, and piled everything onto shipping bases. Mechanical loaders then transported these heavy stacks into massive computer-run holding facilities, sitting there until delivery rigs arrived to take them away. This was the art of smoke production at its absolute peak, polished over many years into a mercilessly streamlined operation. Human staff numbers dwindled as the computers stepped in. Yet those few workers left behind controlled a beast far grander than any setup the company had previously constructed. Now get ready for the most unbelievable aspect of it all. The plan actually succeeded. Even with all the legal battles, the heavy government rules, and fewer people lighting up, overall their flagship brand stayed completely on top. By the time 2024 rolled around, That iconic red brand's grip on American sales was larger than its 10 closest rivals put together. Just let that sink in for a second. While the overall buyer base kept shrinking, the corporation secured its grip so tightly that it basically choked out nearly everyone else in the game. The remaining consumers who still actively bought smokes were choosing that specific cowboy brand by a massive margin. Consumer devotion was completely bulletproof, crafted over many years through iconic advertising and backed by being literally everywhere. That Virginia plant turned into a bizarre contradiction. It was a facility churning out a dying commodity with absolute peak productivity. Annually, the number of tobacco users in the country dropped, yet somehow that same facility continued operating almost entirely maxed out. What was the secret? The answer lies in the fact that the remaining users were consuming heavier amounts, and nearly every single one of them chose that famous red label. The enterprise grew so incredibly powerful that their personal piece of the pie expanded while the overall industry withered away. However, this game plan carried a colossal risk. By putting all their eggs into that one Virginia basket, the domestic branch left its flank totally exposed. A single significant catastrophe, a massive breakdown of machinery, or a lengthy worker walkout meant the whole American supply chain might instantly crumble. They essentially swapped out their safety nets to maximize profits, crossing their fingers against disaster. Up until now, that wager has paid off perfectly. The production lines just keep spitting out packs daily, year over year, without pause. The big rigs continue departing the docks. The cash continues pouring through the doors. The American division basically morphed into a heavy-duty stronghold guarding a decaying empire with cold, calculated precision. Yet kingdoms relying on a lone structural pillar are doomed to fall eventually. We are not asking if the plant will ultimately shut down. The real mystery is the exact date it happens. After all, the corporate bosses fully understand this party has an expiration date. The American smoking scene is on its deathbed. It is just fading out at a snail's pace. So right up until the bitter end, that facility is going to stay open, pumping out hundreds of billions of smokes. It stands as the final massive powerhouse of an expiring national trade. Chapter 8, the modern smoke plant. We need to break down the reality behind manufacturing. Close to 50% of all smokes purchased nationwide inside just one building. That site is way more than a simple workspace. It operates as a heavy-duty citadel, functioning on a level that practically defies belief. Walk through the front doors, and you will stare down one of the most advanced assembly systems on the planet, heavily tweaked over many years for a singular, flawless purpose. Transforming raw leaf into ready-to-smoke sticks with maximum speed and zero waste. The main working area is absolutely gigantic, covering a distance equal to several gridirons laid end to end. Huge banks of equipment sit in perfect alignment with every individual unit functioning as an independent manufacturing powerhouse. Forget about those manual crafting setups from the company's pioneer era. What you have here are hyper-fast beasts that pump out 20,000 sticks every 60 seconds. Think about that figure for a moment. Just while you were digesting this very thought, a single device whipped up more than 1,000 fresh smokes. Running around the clock, every individual piece of hardware generates roughly 2 billion units annually, and that specific location operates dozens of those machines at the exact same time. Everything kicks off with big rigs dropping off massive deliveries of the core ingredient. Enormous bundles of dried crops arrive straight from agricultural fields all over Virginia, North Carolina, and even further away. Raw foliage enters advanced machinery, where it's systematically destemmed, chopped, and mixed to achieve a highly specific recipe. A pack of Marlboros relies on one unique formula, while Virginia Slims depends on another, meaning absolute accuracy is a must for every single label. Even a slight imbalance of ingredients alters the taste, which is why their inspection standards or fanatical uniformity is the name of the game. Someone lighting up a Marlboro in Seattle expects the exact same experience as a smoker in Miami. So after the mix is finalized, it heads straight to the rolling hardware. The technology running the stage is absolutely mind-blowing. The equipment grabs the bulk product, seals it in paper glues on the tips, slices them to the perfect size, and pumps out the final smokes at a blinding speed. Operating with flawless technical accuracy, this gear never needs a break and never loses momentum. The line churns continuously across every single schedule block, yet actually assembling the product is merely part one of the process. The Richmond plant is also responsible for warehousing, which happens to be a truly fascinating operation. They rely on a completely mechanized inventory network functioning essentially like a giant computer-controlled depot. Completed cases are stacked on platforms before automated lifts sweep them up into enormous shelving units reaching high into the ceiling. As soon as a freighted hauler is ready for dispatch, the software pulls the precise crates required and drops them right at the shipping bay. You won't see any manual lifts or employee mistakes here, just seamless robotics managing an unbelievable volume of goods. On any normal day, this location houses countless millions of individual smokes just sitting in reserve for their upcoming transit. Every movement within the supply chain is orchestrated with absolute grace. Semis pull and take on their designated cargo and hit the road toward national supply hubs. Everything must run flawlessly since out-of-stock items cost the company money they refuse to lose. Fans of this flagship brand tend to stick around forever, yet a barren checkout display will push them toward arrival, and you definitely won't overlook this compound if you cruise down Interstate 95. Massive mock-ups of their iconic packs are slapped right onto the exterior, displaying everything from Marlboro Reds to Benson and Hedges Gold's Merit and Virginia Slims. Anyone driving by can clearly see these towering advertisements serving as a larger-than-life declaration that this corporation is standing tall despite a fading market. The company remains fully operational, still producing tobacco goods, and unapologetically flashing their trademarks to countless commuters annually. So what drove them to gamble by centralizing their entire output into a single hub? The reasoning boils down to three primary factors: bulk operational savings, product consistency, and keeping expenses incredibly low. The concept behind large-scale financial efficiency is pretty simple. Shaving just a fraction of a cent off an item translates into massive windfalls when your output hits the hundreds of billions, making a single giant complex far more economical than operating multiple regional sites. You immediately slash administrative roles, cut basic operational costs, and streamline the entire supply chain. Purchasing materials in colossal quantities gives you massive leverage to drive down prices while allowing you to afford top-tier machinery since the expense is offset by the sheer volume of goods made. Maintaining strict standards is a breeze when every step occurs under a single roof. The headache of keeping separate crews perfectly aligned across a bunch of out-of-state plants completely vanishes. The entire staff receives identical instruction works with the exact same gear and adheres to one unified rulebook. Should an issue pop up, it gets handled locally instead of trying to roll out a fix across a fractured network of sites. The ultimate trump card is financial leanness, especially since Philip Morris USA is navigating a shrinking sector with sales dropping annually. Surviving these conditions means cutting all excess weight and running a highly disciplined setup that wrings every possible dime from a dwindling customer base. Closing down the Concord location and moving everything to the Virginia base slash their running expenses by a massive margin. The move meant dropping unnecessary property upkeep, slicing power expenses, and eliminating duplicate machinery. This harsh streamlining is a direct response to consumer trends, though there is an unspoken element at play here: absolute power. Housing all American manufacturing inside one compound gives the brass comprehensive command over everything. Executives have eyes on the whole floor, tweaking and maximizing the workflow instantly, without the headache of the North Carolina branch doing its own thing. There is just this one hub, and it operates strictly by the corporate playbook, effectively transforming the site into an untouchable stronghold in both a literal and tactical sense. It is specifically built to weather union strikes with heavy robotics, significantly cutting down the need for flesh and blood staff. Hardware breakdowns are easily managed because a web of backup machines immediately takes over if a primary unit crashes. The factory is practically immune to delivery hiccups, boasting enough warehouse space to hoard raw goods and keep the lines moving during freight delays. Ultimately, this Virginia compound stands as the peak concluding stage of cigarette production in the United States. The entire sector has been whittled down to its rawest, most streamlined core, ditching any dead weight to focus purely on pushing out an item with a shrinking consumer base that somehow still pulls in billions of dollars. This represents worry-free enterprise stripped down to its absolute most cutthroat basics. Drive revenue up, slash overhead down, and squeeze every last drop until the tank is completely empty. But here is the real kicker. That massive compound, that stronghold, does not actually represent power. Instead, it proves they are just adjusting to an unavoidable downward spiral. The decision to pull all operations into Richmond did not happen due to corporate growth, but rather because the company was steadily shrinking. They constructed the absolute most highly streamlined tobacco manufacturing plant on the planet. They did this fully aware that the United States would likely never require another facility like it. Richmond serves as their ultimate fallback position. It marks the exact location where this massive corporate dynasty holds the line against a totally new cultural landscape. Behind the walls of those half-dozen structures, the equipment constantly operates. The product continuously rolls off the line, and the whole monopoly slowly perishes with every single flawlessly crafted smoke they box up. Chapter 9. The Gradual Fade-Out. Looking at the data paints a crystal clear picture of an industry unraveling in extreme slow motion. Back in 1973, right when the Richmond plant launched, 37% of grown-ups in the U.S. had a smoking habit. We are talking about over 1 out of every 3 adults. Fast forward to 2013, and that figure plummeted to just 19%, cutting the demographic almost perfectly in half. The descent did not stop there either, shedding roughly a full percent with each passing 12 months. Millions of daily users were either kicking the habit or passing away, leaving nobody fresh to fill the gap. The dynasty was not merely falling apart. It was completely vanishing into thin air. Spanning from 1998 all the way to 2019, the total volume of smokes consumed nationwide plummeted by well over 50%. Consider the massive impact that carries for a corporate juggernaut like Philip Morris. 50% of their consumer base wiped completely off the map. 50% of the product they once moved off the shelves suddenly had zero demand. For nearly any other business sector, watching your buyer pool get sliced in half across a 20-year span spells total bankruptcy. Yet Philip Morris managed to stay afloat purely due to the overwhelming chokehold Marlboro held on the public. Even as the overall buyer pool dried up, they simply gobbled up a much bigger chunk of whoever was left. Actual expansion was completely non-existent. They simply played a waiting game and survived longer than the competition. However, the most drastic transformation occurred directly within the youth demographic. During 1997, more than 36% of teenagers currently enrolled in high school were regularly puffing away. Underage tobacco use felt absolutely ubiquitous. You had students sparking up behind the bleachers, hanging around their cars, or chilling at weekend bash gatherings. Skip ahead to 2019, and that statistic completely tanked to a mere 6%. A totally brand new generation completely turned their backs on the habit. That iconic Marlboro cowboy who previously convinced adolescent guys everywhere to pick up a pack saw his influence completely evaporate. Teenagers completely stopped falling for that rugged Western fantasy. Awareness drives launched by health organizations actually succeeded. Commercials aimed at prevention highlighted the brutal, unfiltered truth. They broadcasted patients wasting away from respiratory diseases, relying on electronic devices pressed to their necks just to talk, and hauling around heavy breathing equipment. Absolutely nothing about it felt glamorous or trendy anymore. Lighting up transformed into this lame habit associated with the older generation, something entirely obsolete and practically suicidal. The total evolution of societal norms reached its peak. Furthermore, the executives at Philip Morris spotted the writing on the wall miles away. They recognized that pushing tobacco in the States was ultimately a dying game. Consequently, the top brass began strategizing for an era utterly devoid of regular smokes, or at the very minimum, the classic combustible versions. Back in 1995, they rolled out an initiative dubbed Project Sunrise. This public relations maneuver aimed to heavily overhaul their reputation, trying to paint the conglomerate as a highly ethical enterprise. They threw money at various philanthropic causes. They bankrolled initiatives aimed at keeping teens away from tobacco, which honestly comes off as totally hypocritical from a cigarette manufacturer, yet it served purely as a reputation-saving tactic. The main goal involved cleaning up a corporate identity globally recognized for pushing fatal products and spreading lies. Ultimately, the whole scheme fell flat. No amount of clever marketing can erase the reality of dealing in addictive tar. The general public saw right through the charade. Nevertheless, that Sunrise initiative clearly proved Philip Morris realized they either had to reinvent their entire model or go bankrupt. The million-dollar question remained, what exactly would that next phase look like? A solid path forward finally materialized during the 2010s. The mega corporations started dumping astronomical amounts of cash into substitutes for classic combustible smokes. They engineered the Mark 10, a vaping device specifically rolled out to battle against popular rivals like Juul in the retail space. Vaping technology represented the absolute biggest leap forward regarding how people consume their buzz in roughly half a century. These electronics utilize battery power, to turn chemical juice into an inhalable mist rather than setting dry leaves on fire. With zero actual burning and zero real ash, they were heavily pitched as a much safer habit. Medical experts found themselves completely divided, arguing whether these vapes legitimately helped people step down their intake or simply acted as a fresh trap to hook a new crowd. One fact remained undeniable, though the devices sold like crazy, flying off shelves specifically among the youth demographic who previously shunned old-school paper smokes. Following that came IQOS. At this exact point, the entire situation takes a seriously fascinating turn. That acronym literally spells out "I quit ordinary smoking." Depending on your perspective, that is either a stroke of sheer advertising genius or just incredibly rich hypocrisy. The tech functions as a heat-not-burn system. A user essentially slides a miniature dry leaf cartridge inside and the gadget warms it up just enough to deliver the chemical hit without actually sparking a flame. Executives at the company heavily pushed the narrative that this process was completely separate from a traditional smoking habit. They claimed the risks were drastically lower due to the total absence of lit embers, the lack of dark resin, and the elimination of classic gray clouds entirely. Billions of dollars were pumped into engineering and promoting IQOS all over the planet. The Japanese market served as their initial launchpad and sales absolutely skyrocketed. Hardcore consumers dropped their lighters, transitioned over to the heat-not-burn gadgets by the millions. Shortly after, various international markets jumped right on the bandwagon too. The whole conglomerate shifted its corporate identity to push a smoke-free lifestyle, hyping up IQOS as the definitive path forward. Their brand new catchphrase boldly urged people to unsmoke your world, completely contradicting the very same paper tubes that constructed their massive fortune. By the time 2024 rolled around, Philip Morris International dropped a bombshell that nobody from the previous era could have ever imagined. The cash flowing in from their smokeless lineup had actually eclipsed the sales of their classic smokes. IQOS Zyn nicotine pouches and other substitute goods were suddenly out-earning Marlboro alongside their whole lineup of traditional tobacco. This corporate giant, which once dominated the globe using the rugged Marlboro cowboy, found itself pulling in greater profits from items entirely unrelated to traditional smoking. Just take a moment to appreciate the sheer irony there. For over 100 years, Philip Morris had dialed in the exact science of the cigarette, crafting the single most famous tobacco label on earth and persuading hundreds of millions of folks to light up. Yet suddenly their main objective was deliberately steering those exact same consumers away from regular smokes and pointing them toward modern substitutes. The executives were tearing down their own kingdom piece by piece, fully aware that holding on to the past was a guaranteed ticket to a slow demise. However, the situation is a lot more complicated than it looks. Philip Morris certainly did not pivot out of the goodness of their hearts or some newfound passion for wellness. They made the shift because classic tobacco was staring down total extinction in first world countries. Government rules were clamping down hard. Tax rates were going through the roof. Indoor and outdoor venues alike were aggressively outlawing the habit, and the younger crowd simply had zero interest in picking up the habit. For Philip Morris to stay afloat, they had to transform completely, and that meant leaving behind the very item that built their legacy. Meanwhile, their Richmond operation just kept on humming. Despite the massive corporation loudly promising a future without smoke, the sprawling facility on Commerce Road churned out hundreds of billions of classic sticks annually without missing a beat. The undeniable reality was that millions of folks across the country remained thoroughly hooked. These buyers had no intention of swapping to IQOS. In fact, you could barely find that tech stateside anyway, and giving up the habit altogether wasn't happening either. People kept grabbing packs of Marlboros, continuing to puff on the exact same brand their folks enjoyed. Naturally, Philip Morris was more than thrilled to keep cashing their checks. This created an incredibly weird double life for the brand. On the global stage, Philip Morris International was dumping billions into vapor and pouch tech, pitching IQOS as tomorrow's solution and racking up trophies for health-conscious innovation. Back home, though, Philip Morris USA was running a colossal plant completely devoted to rolling old-school smokes for a dwindling but fiercely lucrative domestic crowd. It was a single corporate entity pushing two entirely contradictory game plans, thanks to a business division that allowed them to play both sides of the fence. Sure, the downward trend dragged on, but there was no stopping it. Each passing 12 months saw usage rates slip, sales figures consistently dipped lower, and the Richmond floor cranked out just a fraction less inventory than it did previously. The industry wasn't crashing overnight. It was simply melting away, acting more like a twilight that drags out over several decades rather than a quick sunset. That was the most bizarre part of the whole scenario. Philip Morris had completely stopped battling the downward spiral. They simply embraced the reality, carefully steering the descent to milk every last cent of revenue, all while quietly erecting a fresh empire based on smokeless alternatives. That iconic cowboy mascot was being silently phased out of the picture, swapped for polished IQOS gadgets and flavor pouches pitched as the trendy, safer way to get a buzz. The very business that historically persuaded the nation that lighting up equated to pure freedom, fierce independence, and rugged manliness was suddenly begging the public to believe that dropping the habit or at least pivoting to modern replacements was the smartest move. It honestly stands as one of the wildest business pivots we have ever witnessed, fueled entirely by sheer survival instinct rather than free will. Evolve or go bankrupt. Philip Morris opted for survival, even if it required slaughtering the legendary cash cow that had paid their bills for a solid 100 years. Chapter 10. The production line that refuses to quit. But here is the crazy detail about that Richmond facility. It is still fully operational. In 2024, the plant is actively rolling out 180 billion smokes annually. Supposedly, the stats fell from a high of 146 billion back in 2010 down to 180 billion today. Hold on, that math seems completely backwards, right? Well, it genuinely makes sense once you account for international shipping and random shifts in manufacturing demands. The main takeaway, however, remains clear. The Virginia plant never closed its doors, and the heavy machinery never truly powered down. Delivery rigs hit the highway daily, packed to the brim with Marlboros destined for corner stores, highway pumps, and smoke shops all over the nation. Even in 2024, Philip Morris USA manages to dominate 45.9% of the domestic retail tobacco sector. That is basically half the pie. Inside a fading market, they have kept their stranglehold purely through insane brand recognition and a customer base that stubbornly refuses to kick the habit. Marlboro is still the undisputed heavyweight champion, totally unbothered, even after 30 years of falling usage. That massive hub down on Commerce Road functions as the core pulse of the country's tobacco scene, even as that pulse undeniably slows down a little more every 12 months. Back in 2017, a pretty bizarre event went down. A section of the Richmond compound, known as the Philip Morris Blended Leaf Complex, landed a spot on the National Register of Historic Places. Just let that sink into your brain for a minute. A literal cigarette plant representing a business responsible for millions of deaths somehow earned official status as a cultural landmark that needed protection. It is basically the equivalent of transforming an active combat zone into a memorial park while the troops are still shooting at each other. Being granted this historical status, it highlighted both the building's striking design and its huge footprint on the nation's manufacturing past. Yet an underlying grimness exists in honoring the site. We are essentially safeguarding a shrine to a kingdom fueled by human dependency. At the exact same time, the corporate giant is plotting its next era in totally different parts of the globe. The executives openly pledged to create a world without combustible tobacco, aiming to swap out classic smokes for modern substitutes. That goal seems incredibly virtuous until you notice they continue raking in 10-figure profits by pushing standard packs in nations lacking strict laws. But following the money reveals the actual narrative. The corporation funneled $1 billion toward an IQOS manufacturing plant overseas in Italy. They also threw $600 million at a Zyn pouch center out in Colorado. Mind you, these are far from mere hobbies. They represent colossal gambles on an era beyond traditional smoking. Consequently, a rather strange contradiction emerges. The Virginia stronghold remains fiercely loyal to old-school tobacco, continuously pumping out packs for domestic consumers who simply refuse to kick the habit. Concurrently, the firm is erecting ultra-modern plants in Europe, and out west crafting goods meant to dethrone the standard smoke. It is a single business existing in two parallel eras at once. Virginia holds on to yesterday. Tomorrow is being assembled in entirely different zip codes. Both avenues generate massive revenue for the time being anyway. The southern facility now stands as a massive tombstone for that mid-century era when lighting up ruled the nation's zeitgeist. Back when that famous rugged cowboy dominated highway signs and glossy centerfolds everywhere. During those days, taking a drag meant you were edgy, independent, and undeniably hip. This specific plant captures the absolute zenith of mass-market leaf manufacturing. It marks the exact period when the corporation mastered the art of rolling smokes with unprecedented speed and volume. The facility serves as proof of free market ingenuity, taking a basic commodity and transforming it into a worldwide juggernaut via genius advertising and cutthroat business tactics. Still, it doubles as a massive grave marker. For this brand, the facility is the final domestic fortress of its type. Executives are not drawing up blueprints for a successor, nor are they adding new wings. All that remains is a highly orchestrated phase-out designed to squeeze out every last dime before the doors finally lock. Each individual smoke coming down the conveyor belt brings the facility nearer to the exact moment its engines power down forever. Tracing the company's journey from a cramped storefront in London's East End all the way to this colossal Virginia plant unveils one of the most fascinating business chronicles ever recorded. The narrative dives deep into immigrant drive, highlighting a German clan that crossed borders to thrive in Britain and achieved wilder success than they ever dreamed possible. It features a fiercely determined widow who flat out rejected the idea of letting her late spouse's life work fade away, keeping the enterprise afloat purely on stubborn grit until it blossomed into a massive powerhouse. Advertising brilliance plays a huge role too, heavily featuring legendary creatives like Leo Burnett and their cowboy mascot who figured out they were peddling much more than dried leaves. They were actually hawking a lifestyle, a fabricated legend, and an idealized version of the consumer's own self-image. Those specific ads did way more than rescue a struggling product line. They forged an Americana legend so potent that 50 years after commercials were yanked from television, everyone still instantly recognizes the guy in the Stetson. The tale also highlights the concept of extreme centralization, underscoring the risky choice to shift every single manufacturing operation into one central hub, proving that streamlining cost trumps having a backup plan during an industry's twilight years. The Virginia complex embodies the absolute extreme of this strategic mindset. You shove your entire operation under a single roof, fortify that roof like crazy, and pray the walls never cave in. Ultimately, the saga centers on shifting tides and what gets left behind. The brand constructed a kingdom out of paper tubes, rising to become an absolute titan of global industry. Yet today it only stays alive by actively tearing down the very foundation that built it brick by brick. Executives are intentionally trying to render their primary moneymaker completely irrelevant, sinking 10-figure sums into substitutes and slapping on a wellness-adjacent label. They are executing a necessary business mutation right in front of our eyes. Meanwhile, the Virginia hub just chugs right along. Employees clock in, engines roar to life, and the raw materials are cured, spun, boxed up, and sent out the door. The finely tuned machinery, honed over countless years, hums flawlessly, cranking out goods that society increasingly shuns, yet a massive craving, consumer base still demands. That reality is their true footprint, an industrial titan that refuses to close its doors even while the culture outside has moved entirely on. It acts as a towering tribute to a business that dictated the nation's habits for 100 years before slowly fading out. This specific building will easily survive the cowboy mascot. It will still be standing long after the legal battles, government red tape, and public health PSN as fade into obscurity. The gears will keep turning until the final domestic customer either kicks the habit or passes away. Even after that milestone, dismantling the whole operation could drag on for several more years. Ultimately, this is the grand narrative of the brand. It traces a path from an English street corner to a southern powerhouse, transforming a humble corner store into the absolute king of combustible tobacco. It perfectly illustrates the fallout of mixing razor-sharp advertising with unmatched manufacturing prowess. It reveals the outcome of blending human dependency with raw free market economics, showcasing a kingdom constructed from ash eventually facing its own inevitable demise. Yet despite everything, that plant down in Richmond just keeps humming along, churning out smokes by the billions. It stands as the ultimate relic of a trade our nation largely rejects, even though we haven't fully kicked the habit just yet.